Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, March 20th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The White House says that it opposes a ceasefire in Ukraine. So the White House has come out against a ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow to potentially mediate between Russian President Vladimir Putin and his counterpart in Kiev. So the Chinese President Xi is due to arrive in Moscow on Monday and is expected to speak virtually to Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, following his talks with Putin. And Xi's trip comes after Beijing released a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine that called for the two sides to cease hostilities and for peace talks to begin. So when China first proposed this peace plan, Zelensky expressed an openness to it. He welcomed China's initiative, but this idea was immediately rejected by President Biden. And now on Friday, White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby was asked about if the U.S. supports a ceasefire in Ukraine or China's efforts to broker a deal. And Kirby said, quote, "We don't support calls for a ceasefire right now. We certainly don't support calls for a ceasefire that would be called for by China in a meeting in Moscow that would simply benefit Russia," end quote. So Kirby's comments come as Ukrainian and Russian forces continue to battle in the Donbass city of Bakhmut, which has become known as the meat grinder due to the heavy casualties. So we're in a very brutal phase of the war. Ukraine has been pouring in barely trained conscripts to fight in the city, and the U.S. actually thinks Kiev is wasting too many resources in the battle. The U.S. and Ukraine's Western backers, they want Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive in the spring. I believe they want them to focus on the south. Although a senior Ukrainian official told the Washington Post last week that Kiev does not have the resources to pull off a counteroffensive. Now, Kirby's reasoning for opposing a ceasefire at this time is that a pause in fighting could concede territory to Moscow. Kirby said that the ceasefire would, quote, "in effect recognize Russia's gains and its attempts to conquer its neighbor's territory by force, allowing Russian troops to continue to occupy sovereign Ukrainian territory. And of course, it would be another continued violation of the UN Charter," end quote. So that's the talking point, is that no, we can't stop the fighting now because then its territorial gains might be recognized then. But if you go back earlier in the war, the US and its allies, they've been discouraging peace talks and ceasefires from the very beginning. That there were talks that took place shortly after Russia's February 2022 invasion. Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was mediating between the two sides. He said his efforts were blocked by the U.S. and its allies. And Turkey hosted talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials. And Boris Johnson, who was the prime minister of the UK at the time, traveled to Kiev and met with Zelensky in April 2022 and told him not to negotiate. They've been discouraging it this whole time. Now, if Ukraine did sign a deal in those days, Russia was asking for, neutrality was the main demand. There was still a lot of details to be worked out, but territorially speaking, they were going to withdraw if they signed a deal to the pre-invasion lines. But now Ukraine stands to lose much more because since then, Russia has really escalated territorially speaking, by annexing the territory that it controls in the Kherson and Zaporozhye oblasts and in the breakaway Donbass republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So here we have the U.S. just coming out against just even a ceasefire, a pause in fighting. They're saying they're against it, and I mean, it really just shows what the U.S. mindset is here. And what I think it is that they want to keep this war going. It seems like, they're hoping that Ukraine is going to regain some territory and a counteroffensive to come, even though there's all these signs, including what I went over last week, U.S. officials speaking to the New York Times, saying that, at the rate that of ammunition that Ukraine is using, it's not sustainable. I think a lot of people in the Biden administration know that Ukraine's not really capable of a counteroffensive, yet this is their public stance. No ceasefire, keep it going. I guess, they got a lot of weapons they want to sell. They want to try to hurt Russia as much as they can. That seems to be their priority, and they don't care about the thousands of young Ukrainian men who are being thrown into this meat grinder, or the Ukrainian civilians whose infrastructure is being bombed. Just doesn't matter to them. All right, the next one here. Slovakia joins Poland in sending MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. So on Friday, Slovakia announced that they're going to send their own MiG-29. These are the Soviet-made fighter jets to Ukraine, making the European countries, and this is Slovakia and Poland, the first two NATO members to provide warplanes to Kiev. So Slovakia's prime minister said that his country will provide Ukraine with 13 fighter jets. And his announcement came after Poland's president said Warsaw will send 4 MiG-29s in the coming days, and then that more will be delivered in the future. So it looks like they might get a few dozen of these MiG-29 fighter jets when this is all said and done. And Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, he said that the plans were an example of the NATO members, quote, raising the level of their direct involvement in the conflict, end quote. But Peskov did also downplay the significance, saying that the MiG-29s will not impact Russia's war plans. Peskov said, quote, the equipment deliveries naturally won't have any impact on the outcome of the special military operation, but it may bring more misfortune to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, end quote. So according to Slovakia's defense minister, the country, Slovakia, they're going to be receiving some compensation. They're going to get a nice little reward for sending these MiG-29s to Ukraine. They're going to be granted $213 million from the EU and some extra EU funding. And the U.S. is also going to provide them with $745 million in unspecified arms. This is according to AP. So send a few old MiGs and the U.S. rewards you. And the U.S. has been encouraging these former Soviet republics who are in NATO to ditch their older Soviet-made equipment in exchange for Western-made arms. Slovakia signed a deal with the U.S. This was back in 2018, and they're purchasing 14 F-16 fighter jets. And that's supposed to replace these MiGs that they're sending off to Ukraine. And these F-16s are expected to be delivered in 2024. So that's where we're at. And again, just a reminder, a year ago, NATO diplomats, the U.S., the Pentagon, thought that sending fighter jets was too much of an escalation. They thought that Russia might perceive it as the alliance directly entering the war. But, they don't care about escalation anymore. All right, the next one here. Ukraine and Russia agree to extend the Black Sea grain deal. So Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he announced on Saturday that the deal between Russia and Ukraine allowing the export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports has been extended. And this deal was first signed in July. It was brokered by Turkey and the UN. And so far, it's been a success in allowing safe passage for grain ships that are leaving Ukraine's Black Sea ports to come and go. And those ports were heavily mined right after Russia launched the invasion. According to reports, over 11 million tons of agricultural products shipped from three of Ukraine's Black Sea ports under this deal. Russian and Ukrainian officials, they gave conflicting claims on how long the extension will last. So Russia is saying that this extension is only for 60 days, while Ukrainian officials are saying that it's going to be extended for 120 days. So it's not clear. Turkey didn't say how long it's going to be extended for. They just said it's extended. And Russia is saying it's only going to be extended for 60 days because they're not happy with the other aspect of the deal, which is that the UN pledged to help ease Western sanctions on Russia to facilitate the export of Russian agricultural goods, grain and fertilizer. And from how I understand it, Russia's been able to sell a lot of grain, but its fertilizer has had a lot of issues. And Moscow saying that not enough has been done to get these shipments going. They've been saying this kind of the whole time and threatening to end this deal. They said they suspended it for a couple days after a Ukrainian drone attack on Crimea. But apparently, the shipments kept going. Even during that short amount of time, it was suspended. And U.S. and other Western sanctions, they technically have exemptions on things like fertilizer. But as we know how sanctions work, they still impede things. They still slow things down, especially when it comes to shipping. Because if you work in a port, if say a port in the EU, it's not supposed to take any Russian ships unless they're shipping, grain or fertilizer. So that means they have to inspect these ships, and that really slows things down. And then, of course, just the other aspect of it, which whenever a country's under heavy sanctions, international banks and businesses, they a lot of times they just don't want to bother doing business with the countries under sanctions, even if there's exemptions, because they just don't want to have to worry about it. All right, the next one here. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has issued an arrest warrant for Putin and other Russian officials. This article is from Connor Freeman. So the ICC, based in The Hague, issued arrest warrants for Putin and another Russian official over the alleged kidnapping and unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. So they're accusing Russia of forcefully deporting children, and this is the ICC. And the whole thing about this is that Russia's not a member of the ICC, and neither is the US. But the US is behind this, supporting this full-throated, them issuing this arrest warrant. And really what this does is that I think it could, impede negotiations. Now, and that's another reason Russia has to think that, they're not going to get they're not going to get anything out of the West, and that they should just keep going with their war. In the ICC, they have no police force or any way to carry out arrests. So, I don't think there's any chance that Putin's actually going to be arrested on this. And of course, Russia's foreign ministry said that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and it bears no obligations under it. And, what's interesting, what Connor points out here, is that the U.S. has a history with the ICC of opposing any of their efforts to investigate the U.S. Back in 2002, George W. Bush signed into law a piece of bipartisan legislation called the American Service Members Protection Act. This law is also known as the Hague Invasion Act because it allows the president to order military action against the Netherlands to protect U.S. soldiers and officials accused of war crimes from ever being prosecuted or taken into custody by the ICC. And during the Trump administration, the U.S. sanctioned ICC officials for attempting to investigate American war crimes in Afghanistan. And then in 2021, the Biden administration lifted those sanctions. But what was interesting, when they lifted them, Blinken, the Secretary of State, said we still oppose ICC efforts to investigate countries that are not members of the court. So you just really see, the U.S. hypocrisy here. They're also against the ICC's efforts to investigate Israel. But here we have them, and Congress has, amended some laws, I think, so they could help the ICC more. And we know that the Pentagon is blocked the U.S. providing evidence of alleged Russian war crimes to the ICC because they're worried that could set a precedent that then Americans can get prosecuted by this court. So it's just such a weird situation here. And again, I think, this comes just ahead of Xi's trip to Moscow. And we know that the Ukrainian officials are demanding, their preconditions for peace talks. So right now are Russia has to withdraw from all the territory it controls, and Russians also have to face war crimes tribunals. So knowing that the ICC is on their side, that can make them less likely to negotiate. I just don't think this symbolic act is going to really accomplish anything more than that. All right, the next one here. So Sunday, March 19th, marked the 20th anniversary of the U.S. beginning its shock and awe air campaign in Iraq. And then March 20th, which is Monday, was the day of the ground invasion. So it's been 20 years since the U.S. invaded Iraq. And we have a lot of stuff on that today. This first article here, this is from Brett Wilkins, and it's how the Iraq war costs could hit nearly $3 trillion by 2050. So as the 20th anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq approaches, a leading research institute on Wednesday said that the total costs of the war in Iraq and Syria are expected to exceed 500,000 human lives and $2.89 trillion by 2050. The Cost of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs said that this budgetary figure includes costs to date estimated about $1.79 trillion, And they also factor in the costs of veterans care through 2050. So the Cost of War Project, they do a lot of really good stuff on, the costs of America's post 9/11 wars and their death toll. And this is in, direct violence in Iraq and Syria post 2003 is 550,000 to 580,000. And if you get into, um, you know, deaths caused by, indirect causes by the war, they say it's several more times than that. So that gets into the millions. And their whole post 9/11 war death total, I believe, is over 800,000. And again, factor in other conflicts that broke out and other indirect causes. It's very easily in the millions. And the number of people that have been displaced are 38 million people in America's post 9/11 wars. So it's very, it just really shows you what what a disaster all this intervention has been since 9/11. And of course, just the invasion of Iraq, which just totally destabilized the region and caused, the war in Syria, destabilized Syria, allowed ISIS to gain a foothold there. The next one here. So this is from Sam Husseini. This is his Substack, and it's titled "Video Clips of Iraq Invasion Lies Beyond Cheney and Bush from Biden to Powell to Pelosi." So he put some clips in here from U.S. officials. And everybody knows what Bush and Cheney did, but there's a lot of officials still in government today, including President Biden. And really what I wanted to go over here is Biden, he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time in the Senate. Democrat, he whipped up a lot of Democratic support that was needed to sign off on Bush's invasion of Iraq. And he has totally lied about it since. He says now, while he was running for president, he said right after, Bush invaded, right after the invasion, right after shock and awe began, I was completely against the war. But that's not true at all. Several years after, he was saying that he supported the war. And there's some clips here that I'll play for you of Biden. So this is from Sam, and this is before the invasion. This is his war speech in the Senate, trying to get support for.
Saddam is dangerous. The world would be a better place without him. But the reason he poses a growing danger to the United States and its allies is that he possesses chemical and biological weapons and is seeking, with his $2 billion a year illegally skimmed from the UN Fund for Food, his oil for food program, for peace program, that he is seeking nuclear weapons. And for years now, he has prevented the United Nations inspectors from uncovering those weapons and verifying Iraq's disarmament. And he is in violation of the terms he agreed to, allowing him to stay in power.
And then Sam says that, because those were all lies that he said, cooked up by U.S. intel about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. And perhaps Biden's biggest lie, Sam says, was from April 2007. He claimed on Meet the Press about Saddam's alleged WMDs. He said, quote, "The real mystery is if he didn't have any of them left, why didn't he say so?" End quote. But of course, Hussein did say exactly that, and his claims were derided and dismissed by Biden and his ilk. So, pretending like Saddam and Iraq weren't saying, we don't have, these weapons that you say we have, and they did let inspectors in. And then, so now this is after the invasion. So again, when he was running for president, Biden lied. He said, he supported Bush before the invasion, then right after he was against it. But for a few years after, he was still very much in support of it. This is a few months after the invasion.
Some of my own party have said that it was a mistake to go to Iraq in the first place and believe that it's not worth the cost, whatever benefit may flow from our engagement in Iraq. But the cost of not acting against Saddam, I think, would have been much greater. And so is the cost, and so will be the cost, of not finishing this job. The President of the United States is a bold leader, and he is popular. The stakes are high, and the need for leadership is great. I wish he'd use some of his stored up popularity to make what I admit is not a very popular case. But I and many others will support him when he makes the case.
So there you have it. And it is amazing, I think, just how Biden got away with those lies during the debates and while he was running for president. Just nobody really cared, even though, Bernie Sanders, I think, said in one debate, he was defending Biden from Iraq war criticism. He said, oh, that was a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. It's just the 20th invasion now. So the president of the United States, why I think this is so important is that he did play such a pivotal role in the invasion of Iraq, and he's lied about it. And now he's running this Ukraine policy, and who knows what he's lying about. He's lying about what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. And then just go check out Sam's article. His Substack is always interesting, but he just puts in a lot of clips here from U.S. officials, including Pelosi, who she voted against the war, but she still repeated a lot of the lies. All right, the next one here. Turkey plans to approve Finland's NATO bid. So Erdogan said Ankara would approve Finland's NATO application before the country's May election. So here we go. It looks like NATO will expand into Finland. This article is from Kyle Ansel, and he wrote this up on Friday. Finland submitted a joint application with Sweden to join the North Atlantic Alliance last May, while most members of the alliance wanted to expedite membership for the Nordic countries. Turkey resisted due to Helsinki and Stockholm support for Kurdish groups, which Ankara views as terrorists. I've been covering this a lot. Basically, Turkey signed this trilateral agreement with Sweden and Finland in June 2022 on steps that they could take to join NATO. And basically, Turkey's not happy with Sweden. They think Finland has done enough, and it looks like they are going to approve them. And I'm surprised, actually, that it's coming before the election. I thought they would wait till after the presidential election in Turkey, but it looks like they're going to go ahead. He said that they decided to start the ratification process in Turkey's parliament. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to start, but Finland's the big one when it comes to expanding NATO and raising tensions with Russia. They share an over 800-mile border with Russia. That's a huge border, and it would actually double the border between NATO and Russia. It would double NATO territory on Russia's border. So it's significant, and Russia is making plans to expand its military. That includes, of course, deploying more military in Western Russia by that border. And Finland is beefing up their border with Russia. So it's going to become a very militarized region, I think. All right, the next one here. Iran's president welcomes an invitation from the Saudi king after the normalization deal. So Ebrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, he's welcomed an invitation from Saudi King Salman to visit Riyadh following a China-brokered normalization deal between the two countries. So this is a sign, I think, that, after this deal, it looks like both sides are pretty serious about it. There's been a few indications that they are, and I think this is one of them. An Iranian official said that Salman wrote a letter to Raisi welcoming the normalization agreement, invited him, and then Raisi welcomed the invitation. So it sounds like Raisi is going to go to Saudi Arabia. And Iran and Saudi Arabia, they agreed to reopen embassies and establish full diplomatic relations for the first time since 2016 within 2 months of signing the agreement. Iranian and Saudi officials have signaled that they intend to take other steps to solidify ties, including by investing in each other's countries. Saudi investments are expected to start in Iran pretty soon. And of course, this deal has the potential to significantly ease regional tensions. The UN envoy for Yemen said that there's a renewed momentum toward ending the war in Yemen, which is great. Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Houthis, they've been engaged in Omani-mediated peace talks. So there's been a few media reports, one from the Wall Street Journal, and then I saw another one from the Middle East Eye that said Iran agreed to stop arming the Houthis as part of this deal. Although, Iran has always denied accusations that they arm the Houthis. And Iran is a political ally of the Houthis, but, they're not involved right now in the negotiations to end the war. It's Saudi Arabia and the Houthis and the Saudi-backed government in Yemen. Because, it's kind of portrayed in our media, especially the Wall Street Journal, who first reported this, that Iran is sort of an equal party to the conflict, but they've never directly entered the war. And I'm sure they've given them some material support when it comes to arms, but we don't know to what extent, despite all the claims that you see. And it's nothing compared to what the U.S. provides the Saudi-led coalition with. For the Saudis, it's an air force. The U.S. and Britain and France, they wouldn't have an air force if not for them. If Iran's arming the Houthis, they might just be shipping in, guns and maybe some missiles and possibly drones. But again, we just don't really know what the situation is. But it's good either way. Again, they are politically aligned with the Houthis. And the Houthis did welcome this Saudi-Iran deal. So they were happy about it, which I think is a good sign. So let's hope, that they sign a deal. All right, the next one here, Serbia and Kosovo. They discuss an EU plan to normalize ties. So the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo, they met in North Macedonia on Saturday to discuss a deal put forward by the EU to improve ties between Belgrade and Pristina. Kosovo formally declared its independence from Serbia in 2008, and that was almost 10 years after the 1999 NATO bombing campaign that separated the territory from Serbia. But Serbia and many other countries have not recognized Kosovo as an independent state. So under this 11-point deal put forward by the EU, Kosovo and Serbia would agree not to resolve disputes with violence, and they would not block each other from joining international organizations. Both Serbia and Kosovo, they want to join the EU, and the EU says that you guys have to mend ties before joining. The deal would also result in a de facto normalization. It doesn't explicitly say that they have to normalize relations, but it would require each country to recognize the other's national symbols and official documents, including passports, diplomas, license plates, and customs stamps. The EU plan would also allow some autonomy for Kosovo's ethnic minority Serbs. The deal, so the way that this is written out in this deal, because this is a big point of tensions, is that there's Serbs who live in northern Kosovo, and they don't recognize Kosovo as an independent state either. They say they're part of Serbia, and they answer to Belgrade. So there's a lot of tensions over that, and this deal would give them autonomy. It calls on both governments to, quote, ensure an appropriate level of self-management for the Serbian community in Kosovo and ability for service provisions in specific areas, including the possibility for financial support by Serbia, end quote. Following 12 hours of talks between Kosovo's Prime Minister Albin Kurti and Serbian Prime Minister Aleksandar Vučić, the two leaders said good progress was made, but a final deal was not signed. Kurti, he blamed the Serbian side for the lack of a formal agreement, and then he had Vučić saying that he signaled that more talks will happen soon. And I saw comments from Josep Borrell, who's the EU's foreign policy chief, kind of made some contradicting comments saying that they agreed on some kind of deal, and then he said they didn't. So there's some misleading headlines that said that they agreed on a deal to normalize ties, but that's not what happened. But it does look like they've made progress, and they're going to keep talking. So we'll see how it all plays out. And the last story in the news section today, it is from the New York Times. It's interesting. It's one man's story about sabotaging Jimmy Carter's reelection in 1980. It's a guy named Ben Barnes. He was a politician who traveled to the Middle East as part of a mission to tell Middle Eastern leaders to convey to Iran, this was during the hostage crisis, that if Reagan is elected president, that he's going to have a better deal for the Iranians to release the hostages, basically telling them don't release the hostages while Carter is president. And this is something people have long, known about, but I think this is the first real confirmation that this is what happened here. So go check that out. It's an interesting read. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have a lot of good ones today. One from Ray McGovern about Iraq at 20 years, the uses and abuses of national intelligence estimates. One from Ted Snyder, the Minsk deception and the planned war in the Donbass. One by Jeremy Earp, 20 years later, the media's complicity is sent down the memory hole. And that's, of course, about the invasion of Iraq. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington is the midwife to the birth of any China-Russia alliance, just about how U.S. policies have led to China and Russia drawing closer together. And then our spotlight is from Scott Horton, Iraq War II, 20 years later. So his piece on that. But that's everything for today. You could always support the show, support antiwar.com at antiwar.com/donate, and share the show around. Tell your friends about us and all that good stuff. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.